second get to go today. I was at Harvard debate camp doing the same thing, like sitting in the room getting lectured to. So this is kind of neat. But my name's Jordan Cohen. I'm a PhD student here at Mason. A lot of my research revolves around kind of arms sales, and so just from a few connections, I'm speaking here today. So I'm going to kind of start broad and then get specific as we go along. So what are arms sales is obviously the first question. But before we even talk about that, it's going to be really helpful to take a step back up here. Yep, all right, so just take a quick step back. The Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, which is an organization you guys should really get to know because they have a ton of data. And this past year-long report estimates world military spending in 2018 to be 2.5% of all global spending whatsoever. And because of that, it's not a real surprise that the US and the world spends a lot of money on weapons and on arms. But before we kind of get to where we are in 2018, it's going to be really important to look at some history. So this is after the Cold War. Those bars, and this came out terribly, are the amount of global military spending. And so you see as the Cold War ends in the 90s, military spending decreases. The Clinton administration, along with a lot of international organizations, call this in broad parts the peace dividend. And they say, well, we're not going to need to spend as much money on military spending. We're not going to need to spend it on weapons development. We can put it in healthcare. We can put it in welfare, et cetera. That didn't work. And so you see after that dip in the mid-90s, by 2015, military spending has increased beyond what it was even during the Cold War. And as a consequence, it is now one of the, again, largest amounts of just global spending on any subject whatsoever. And so a lot of people say they were hoping for, or this is a comment that talks about how, well, we wish we could have gotten a better return for a peace dividend other than a swing on a tank. In its relationship with the outside world, the U.S. devotes 1,400% more money projecting military power than it does building alliances and finding non-military solutions to conflict. We spend a lot of money on military spending. What this graphic shows is the Department of State in the black, so that's what we spend on the on the State Department, and in the white is Lockheed Martin, which is a defense contractor that builds lots of weapons. And as you can see, on basically every year, Lockheed Martin is well over 50% of what we spend compared to the State Department. So we spend a lot of money just on that one defense contractor. As you can imagine, a lot of that money to defense and to military power goes to defense contractors. So we give a ton to Lockheed Martin, we give a ton to Boeing, we give a ton to Raytheon. And if you guys walk around campus at all in any of the buildings, you'll start to see kind of a lot of these like Lockheed Martin signs. And that's because, like a lot of public universities, defense contractors build relations with them. And so we give a lot of money, and that money goes a lot to weapons development, buying and selling weapons. So now we can actually talk about what arms sales are. It's going to be easier to start with what arms sales are not. Number one, arms sales are not security assistance. If the U.S. is giving something to another country for free, that is not an arms sale. Second, they are not stationing foreign troops for non-weapons training purposes. So when you see the U.S. sends 10,000 troops to Pakistan, that is not necessarily an arms sale. Generally, it's not. Generally, it's a form of aid. Relatedly, most of the time, they aren't even stationing foreign troops for weapons training purposes unless that weapons training was specifically done in coordination with an arms sale. And so you see this a lot in Africa where we will sell them weapons and then sell them troops on top of those weapons to train them in how to use those weapons. So that can be considered an arms sale. But short of that, putting troops on a foreign soil is not arms sales. Next, they are not economic aid, and relatedly, they're not humanitarian aid. Again, any form of aid is not an arms sale. And I don't know the exact wording for this topic, but I imagine if I were debating something on arms sales, I would expect to see teams run in with, like, we give X amount of money to Y country. But if that X amount of money to Y country is not specifically part of a sale, even if it's related to it, it is not an arms sale. It is security assistance, economic assistance, etc. So the best thing to do when you don't know what something is not go to government websites to look at their definition. This is why The Department of State defines an arms sale as government-to-government arms transfers and commercial export licensing of U.S. origin defense equipment and technology consistent with et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Basically tells you nothing about what an arms sale actually is. So I was like, okay, well, the State Department's wordy, but maybe the Defense Department that gets all that money is going to have a good definition for an arms sale. And they don't. They say defense articles and services to foreign countries and international organizations when the president formally finds it to do so, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Again, they're not talking what an arms sale is. So here are 3 definitions that I think are short, pithy, and sweet and do a really, really good job defining what arms sales are. So Security Assistance Monitor, it's another resource you guys should get to use because they track they track all U.S. arms sales and they track a few other things, so it'll be good to look into. But they define arms sales as U.S. military and equipment services sold to a foreign country. And then at the end of that, it's like consistent with Act 1, 2, and 3. The second definition is by SIPRI, which I mentioned earlier. That's the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, also a good organization to get familiar with. And they say an arms sale is a sale of military goods and services to military customers, including sales for domestic procurement and sales for export. I happen to think that's a really good definition. I think the SIPRI definition does about as good of a job at just kind of like getting to the core of what an arms sale is as anything else. My definition that we've used in papers is any military equipment, goods, or services sold to military customers. Moreover, they do not include anything given to said country in a way that is not a sale. So again, if it's not in a sale, if there's not an exchange of goods, it's not an arms sale. So how does the arms sale process work? It's really wordy. I'm going to do my best just to talk it out without kind of using the quotes on there. So there are 3 types of three very broad types of what the U.S. categorizes as weapons. First is non-sellable weapons: nuclear weapons, biological weapons, and chemical weapons. On top of that, does anybody here know what the Office of Net Assessment is? All right, so the Office of Net Assessment is a part of the Department of Defense, and they deal with a lot of kind of future technology. So when you hear about these kind of drones that are microscopic, you can't even see, they can go into somebody's head and explode, that's Office of Net Assessment. Anything the Office of Net Assessment works on, they can tell the Department of State, they can tell the president that we are not selling that, and they have veto power. So again, these kind of just fit in the non-sellable weapons. You don't need to worry about these. The second is small and light weapons, or SALW. These generally are ammunition equipment, and government allows companies to sell these through direct commercial sales. So for these types of weapons, Raytheon, Boeing, Lockheed Martin don't even need to work with the U.S. government. They can sell straight to other countries. Recently, there is some regulation on small arms and light weapons that is kind of going through Congress, and Trump has tried pulling out of it, or it said he was going to pull out of a treaty. One thing about the small and light weapons deal is the NRA wants them completely unregulated, and the NRA says they want them completely unregulated specifically because they think if they're regulated, that means domestically the U.S. can start cracking down on the sale of like guns, just in the U.S. And so the Republican Party, this is like kind of a political capital point, the Republican Party is generally for deregulating all small and light weapon sales, where the Democratic Party usually is kind of more for putting checks and balances on them. Then the final category, and this is kind of the big area where a lot of the arms sales debate focuses, is major conventional weapons. So if you look at the U.S., what do they call it? USML, I forgot what it stands for, but it is effectively U.S., I forget. But anyways, basically it's categories 4 through whatever, like 17 in this document. And this is like planes, tanks, ships, missiles, automobiles, etc. Everything else. U.S. is the dominant exporter of major conventional weapons. They sell 36% of all global major conventional weapons. Most of my discussion from here on out is going to talk about this because this is where most of the academic literature exists. What I will say, though, on top of that is with small and light weapon sales, the academic literature talks a lot about how these are bad for conflict, and that they lead a lot to future conflict. And so if you're going to go that angle, I would look at small and light weapon sales. Again, though, just know that in a lot of situations they're not regulated, or the regulations we have are in name only, and it doesn't actually do much of anything. All right. So how do we go about selling these major conventional weapons? There's a few steps. The first step in the process is countries must make a request to the Pentagon or the State Department. These agencies then work together to assess strategic and political implications of the proposed purchase. This is required by the Arms Export Control Act that was passed by Richard Nixon in the 1970s. So the idea here is the Pentagon and the State Department sit down together. They look and say, all right, are these weapons going to be dangerous if we sell them to X country, et cetera, et cetera. Spoiler alert, we sell to 168 countries across the globe. They very rarely, actually, they've never stopped it, but ostensibly they can. All right, so the second step is after the assessment is carried out, the State Department issues a notification of the sale to Congress. So when you're going to look at data, what a lot of it's going to separate from are notification and sales. And the reason for this is usually after notification, it can take anywhere between 5 to 10 years to even sell the weapons. Because the second the notification goes, the defense companies start building the weapons. So there is quite kind of a delay after the notification before the sale. So if you're looking at data, and like if you go to the Security Assistance Monitor, look at the notifications data and look at the deliveries data. You'll see some decent separation in what we're notifying and what's actually getting delivered. All right, so after the notification, Congress has 15 to 30 days to review the sale, and because Congress is just so great at getting stuff done, that was a joke, and nothing happens. And so if there is opposition, then Congress must pass a resolution in both chambers to block the sale. Again, they have 15 to 30 days to review before the sale starts going through. Now, effectively, Congress can cancel the sale at any point up until delivery. They're not going to do that though, and they've tried in the past, like individual congressmen have tried in the past, but then what happens is you get the defense industry lobbyist against you. And it's because what happens, like if you agree to a sale and you tell Lockheed Martin, you're going to make these weapons, and Lockheed Martin spends 3-4 years building the weapons, then Congress says, wait, hold on, let's not sell them. Lockheed Martin has lost money. And they have these weapons that the U.S. isn't going to buy, so they're not going to do much with it. They're just sitting there. And so that never happens because the resources have already been invested. Again, Congress have never actually blocked an arms sale, ever. So a lot of this is kind of in name only, but this is the process of how a sale works. All right, so before I get to why the U.S. sells weapons, does anybody have any questions at this point? Yes, ma'am.
The paper that you talked about where you look at arms sales, is that
Yeah, you can. Well, so mine is coming out in the next 10 days, but there's a version of it that was released last year that I'll talk about. But if you go to the Cato Institute and the risk and arms sales assessment, they use the same definition or very similar. Yeah. Arms sales are a form of trade. They're like it depends on the trade statistic you use. But again, as long as a sale, there is a sale. There has to be an exchange of goods, and then that process has to be met. If those two things don't happen, it's not a sale. All right, everybody good? Okay. Oh, yes, sir.
Can you define a sale as if you're like getting some sort of other assistance? Like, you say like drugs, giving them weapons so you get more political power?
No. I mean, well, okay, so this is policy debate, so I mean, if you want to, you probably can get away with it. But as a general rule, by the definition of what a sale is, that would not be a sale. It has to be weapons in exchange for monetary goods. Otherwise, it's security assistance. And security assistance is a whole different ballgame. There's a lot of stuff written on security assistance, and very little of it's actually good. What the main finding behind security assistance is it doesn't give the U.S. any actual leverage, and it leads to a lot of war. Do you have a $20 bill? Yeah. Good? All right. So there are three broad reasons. I don't know why I use these three: power, profit, and prudence, but it fits enough. So three broad reasons. So power, it gives U.S. strength, strategic advantage; profit, money; and prudence, we have the weapons to sell, so we're going to sell them. All right, power. So this I just thought was a funny cartoon. China, the U.S. with an ATM. They're defending this money in the sale. All right, so power is most strategic considerations, sans one of them, I'll get into that one later, but what I mean here by power is strategic considerations that do not factor in risk. Broadly, a lot of what you'll read says this power impact happens two ways. One, it increases allies' military capacity, and two, it helps the U.S. exert leverage. Let's dive into this. Allied military capacity. All right, so, and the political cartoon is actually from the Cold War. It's, I think, from 1949, and it's making fun of like the U.S. dollar, like we're just giving weapons to everybody in exchange for money. The other is a chart I made that, again, will be in the document in 10 days, and it looks at the sum of U.S. arms sales in billions of U.S. dollars to allies. So banned countries, which are not allies. So the U.S. has a list of countries that it will not sell arms to. That list changes pretty frequently. There's a few countries that have been on there forever, like Iran, but as a general rule, they flip over and over. So the little dot that you see there is actually Lebanon, when we sold a little bit to Lebanon even when they were banned during the Civil War. Then you have informal ally. Informal ally are two countries, Taiwan and Saudi Arabia. And the reason Taiwan and Saudi Arabia are considered informal allies is that neither country actually wants a formal alliance agreement. But if you read any of kind of the literature on alliances, Saudi Arabia and Taiwan behave just like any other ally behaves. The behavior matches perfectly. In a lot of ways, though, the way we give a guarantee that they would get from an alliance agreement without the alliance agreement is through arms sales. So there's an article in 2015 by Kieran Yarhimilo, and I sent a kind of bibliography that my guess is either has been or will be sent around, and so you can find this. But Kieran Yarhimilo says for informal allies, arms sales take the place of alliances, but otherwise they function in the same way. And again, Saudi Arabia and Taiwan hold a lot of diplomatic leverage over the U.S., or at least the U.S. behaves as such as if they do. And so as you can see, those two countries get a, pardon my language, fuckload of arms sales, academic term. NATO allies get a lot of money. Non-allies do not get nearly as much as any of the other categories outside of band, and non-NATO allies just make bank. Non-NATO allies consistently, and again, this gets to like the Yarhimilo piece from 2015 I just talked about, which is that for non-NATO allies, without the multilateral alliance, arms sales help strengthen that alliance. They behave in a similar way as an alliance does. The point of all this is we've given a lot of money to allies in the past, especially during the Cold War with NATO countries, to boost their military capacity. And I've talked to people at State Department, I've talked to people like staffers who are on the House Senate or the House Armed Services Committee, and what they'll all say is the reason the U.S. sells arms is we want to strengthen our allies. I'll get into that a little bit more later. This is the number one way like these strategic military calculations happen. The second is leverage. And so this is when we sell arms to a weaker state to get something. My favorite example of this is the 1970s with Iran, 1960s, 1970s, and it's my favorite example because I've done a lot of work on it. But Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger effectively in these diplomatic meetings said we are going to up the amount of weapon sales we make to Iran because that means they cannot leave us as an ally. And they're in an important area, they're an important buffer against the Soviet Union, and so we're going to create a dependence where Iran depends on us to keep their economy alive. The problem with that is military spending goes in one way, but it never goes out. It just sits. And so it never gets reinvested in the economy. And so by 1976, Iran was spending over 50% of its entire budget on U.S. military weapons and military training. So U.S. troops were there, but they didn't actually have money to spend on other resources. And so by 79, you see the Iranian Revolution, which has given us somewhat the regime we see today. But that is a common way the U.S. uses weapons. You'll see a lot of the arms sales with African countries are used this way. And so you give them weapons, and with the weapons, you also sell them troops to train them. And in doing so, you hope to have an influence. The counterpoint to this, and again, I'll talk about counterpoints in a little bit, but the big counterpoint to this is Saudi Arabia. We sell Saudi Arabia weapons. 2 years ago, they used them in Yemen to bomb a school bus. Then we said, okay, well, we'll sell you better weapons, and we'll sell troops to train you so you don't kill Yemeni civilians, and they've killed more Yemeni civilians since that point. So that's kind of one of the big counterpoints. While I take a sip of my coffee, does anybody have any questions on those two little blips? Yeah. The U.S. The U.S. won't say that, like the government won't say that publicly. They use the term leverage or influence, and that's what that means. That's one half of it. The other half of it is the U.S. thinks that it can strengthen allied military capacity in the case of a war. So like we sell a shitload to Japan, and the reason why we sell so much to Japan, at least based on like what the U.S. will tell you, is that they're a key ally in the region, and what they mean by that is if there's a war with China, we want Japan having the best weapons possible.
So,
Yeah, I mean, again, the biggest way is when you create military dependence, it becomes very difficult for countries to leave you as a partner or as a coalition member. And so in World War One, actually reverse leverage happened where the U.S. told the entire world, like in 1914, we will sell you weapons. But what they're really gearing towards is we will sell the Entente, so like Britain, France, eventually Italy, Serbia, weapons. Germany could have bought them if they wanted, but it would just be very difficult. And by 1917, the U.S. economy was actually dependent on the Entente winning the war. And so it played a large role in Woodrow Wilson's reasons for going into war. And so, but generally speaking, the leverage is that you create a dependence. So the U.S. economy grew significantly during World War I, and Britain became dependent on the U.S. for weapons. So, yes, ma'am.
Just to clarify, some of this other countries does help on the
Oh, I'll get there. I will get there. Don't you worry. All right. Well, on that note, let me get there. So, profit. This is kind of the main competitor to the power narrative. Generally, politicians will give you both, but they'll prioritize one. Since 2002, American arms exports have ranged between 15 and 75 billion US dollars per year, representing as much as 4 to 5% of total American exports annually. The civilian defense industry employs almost 2 million people. And then by increasing the total number of orders for expensive weapon systems, so F-35 is a weapon system you should become familiar with, just because it's the source of a lot of debate, especially with Turkey and Taiwan. But when they sell that, what that money then does is it reduces the amount the U.S. spent on those weapons. So let's say the U.S. spends $10 billion, which is nothing, but let's just $10 billion, it's easy, on F-35s. And then they sell $5 billion of F-35s to other countries. The U.S. actually hasn't even just spent $5 billion net because of the sales. They've spent less than that because there's discounts. And a lot of times that's what happens is these sales get discounted. And so like Lockheed Martin will say, all right, we'll sell you 10 billion. And if you sell 5 to the other countries, we'll lower your cost to just 8 billion total. So really it's 3 billion net. That happens a lot. Related to this, a lot of times we sell weapons to another country. So like we'll sell these weapons to Saudi Arabia, and then we'll also cut a deal with Saudi Arabia. So we get the benefit from Lockheed Martin. Then you cut a deal with Saudi Arabia and you say, listen, like we'll pay Saudi Arabia X amount of money in cash. So we don't need to send people over. And so you spend even more on the sale. And so what ends up happening is the U.S. uses these arms sales to offset the cost of buying these weapons. These are kind of the 3 main areas where you see the profit narrative. One, it just generally strengthens the U.S. economy. More imports in dollars are a good thing. 2 is the civilian defense industry is massive. And then 3 is we cut deals in ways that it makes us buying our own weapons much cheaper. Just for examples of politicians, even Barack Obama, who people think was kind of anti-arms sales, was actually pretty for it. He said by enhancing the competitiveness of our manufacturing and technology sectors, they'll help us not just increase exports and create jobs, but strengthen our national security as well. That's kind of one example of when a president almost connects the two, but have no fear. Because now we have a president that literally connects the two. So he says, when a proposed transfer is in the national security interest, which includes our economic security, and in our foreign policy interest, the executive branch will advocate strongly on behalf of U.S. companies. And the Trump administration has, like in a weird way, seen less money in arms sales, but has increased the amount of arms sales since the Obama administration. And that's just, again, that notifications versus deliveries thing. So eventually that won't be the case. You looked like you're...
So earlier you said something about like how Congress is never blocked an arms sale.
Mm-hmm.
So what's the Saudi Arabia and the Yemen?
Right. Okay, so that's really interesting. The Congress passed a resolution but they passed it in the House. And I don't know if it got passed in the Senate, but again, to even block an arms sale, you can't just pass, like, you pass the resolution, and then it takes years to block the sale. On top of that, a lot of what we've already sold in Saudi Arabia, we've agreed to sell. And so again, you're not going to block Lockheed Martin for making a sale because you will get voted out of office. So anything Lockheed Martin's already built is still going to go to Saudi Arabia. So it's kind of like one of those small baby steps into controlling sales, but Congress is limited in what they can do.
So, realistically, these companies have very little checks on who they can sell to and where they can sell and how much.
I mean, ostensibly they have a lot of checks, but in reality they don't. I mean, in name they have checks, but as long as, and there's a quid pro quo. Like if you talk to people who work at Lockheed Martin, they know the quid pro quo. They're not going to sell weapons to terrorist groups. They're not going to sell them to countries that sponsor terrorist groups. And in exchange, the U.S. will let them price it however they want and sell to whoever they want. Okay. Finally, the kind of final motive, and this is what I said I'll get back to from the strategic narrative, is risk. And this idea is, listen, we sell to a lot of countries, there are strategic benefits. What about if there's a country, though, that's risky, right? So Saudi Arabia is a great example. Any country that's either engaged in a current conflict, Taiwan's another good example, insofar as there's kind of this quiet conflict between Taiwan and China. And if you sell arms to Taiwan and they go to war with China, then all of a sudden you're involved. And so risk is kind of this last point. And the question is, do we actually do anything about risk? Well, the Trump administration will tell you they're terrified of selling risky places. I have a lot of quotes from the latest kind of arms sales statement. There's a lot, but just generally no. Trump says he's very concerned with risk. He won't sell to risky countries. But Saudi Arabia is cool. So, and I'll get to risk more in detail now. So what is it, power, profit, or prudence? I've said I'm working on something that's going to come out in the next 10 to 14 days. It's with the Cato Institute. And so again, just keep your eye out for it. But this is kind of a chart we have from our new data set. But in 2018, the Cato Institute, when I was not part of them, released an arms sales risk index. You can go online now and look that up, and it has everything on there. The index uses 6 different metrics to create. So we look at state fragility, we look at if they're engaged in a current conflict, we look at state terrorism, we look at non-state terrorism, we look at corruption, and we look at Freedom House scores. And we weight those 6 metrics more or less evenly, we combine them, and we create a risk index. So if you look at this chart, that's the mean of U.S. arms sales on the y-axis. So that's how much, like on average, we sell these buckets. 1 to 15 is the least risky, 63 to 100 is the most risky. And those are evenly spaced quintiles. So all those quintiles have the same number of states. What you can see is we sell almost as much to the most risky as we do to the least risky. And if you count the second most risky versus the rest, we just sell, it doesn't matter. Risk does not matter where we sell weapons. We say it does, but in generally when you sell weapons to 168 different countries and a few of the most risky get the most weapons, you're going to get, that's what you're going to see. So here are just some examples. These are the 15 riskiest major customers of U.S. weapons from 2002 to 2018. Again, this will be in the next 10 to 14 days when Cato Institute releases it. This will be on there. But so you see Saudi Arabia is one of the most risky countries in the world by our index, and that kind of fits everywhere. And we've sold them over $30 billion in U.S. weapons since 2002. There's other examples on there. Turkey's another really good example. Israel's a good example. Iraq's a great example. Egypt, India may become a good example in the future. We sell a lot of weapons to risky places. Also on the data, it'll be broken down by year, and so that'll be out in 10 to 14 days. But a lot of these don't change. We have not seen major increases to any of these countries since 2002 outside of Iraq. But we've not seen many cuts. Generally, when we start selling arms somewhere, we don't stop, especially at a sizable value. The one good thing the U.S. can say for it is they care more about risk than Spain, France, Russia, and China. Spain, France, Russia, and China, especially China, sell to the most risky countries. And if you listen to these guys, they do it because of leverage. And they will tell you straight up, they do it because of leverage. They want to have leverage against the riskiest countries. Still, the U.S. is pretty high up there. So they're fifth. So the U.S. sells to risky places a lot. They don't care much about risk. All right, so let's go back and look at kind of just basic strategic considerations. So we have it's a working paper. If you email me, I can send it, but like just please cite it because it's not out there yet. But just email me if you want it. But we look at a lot of data since 2002 and we use regression analysis. What we found is controlling for other factors, the United States sells over twice as much to allies as to non-allies when you hold everything else at their meeting. And so generally what we have found is that ally status matters a lot. That even holds if you don't count Saudi Arabia and Taiwan as allies. If you say, well, they're informal, so don't count them. We sell a lot more to allies than non-allies, and it's strategic. I mean, that's what the U.S. will tell you. They want to strengthen ally military capacity. We also find, and you can see in the kind of top left corner, those two tables. So that is risk score and ally, and the curve is exactly the same for what we sell. It just, we sell more to allies, but risk does not matter. Risk is the x-axis, doesn't have any substantial impact. Economic considerations, we find that just trade and military expenditures matter a lot. I mean, those are just kind of like very clear. The more we trade with you, the more you spend on military expenditures. And it's kind of like a no dust statement, but the more we will sell you in weapons. So here I think is a really cool chart, and this will be on the PowerPoint, but it's the top 20 customers of American major conventional weapons since 2002. And when you just look at it, they are almost all allies. There are, I think, 2 non-allies. Yeah, there are 2. Iraq is technically a non-ally, and UAE is a. Yes, sir. I heard a whoa. No. Okay. Singapore. There you go, Singapore. But so 3. Still, point being, generally we sell to allies. We sell a lot in weapons, and risk doesn't really have any substantial impact. Yeah.
Why is Taiwan so low?
So it effectively comes down to Taiwan is not really engaged in any major conflicts. I actually think that score is wrong on there. I think go back. Oh, maybe not. Yeah, Taiwan may just not have a lot of risk. I actually probably need to go back and look at that. But my guess is they're not a fragile state. They're democratic. There's substantial freedoms in Taiwan. Just the metrics we use, Taiwan doesn't meet much of them. But Taiwan's one of those like, well, yes, it's not risky by like a definable metric, but it's neighbors with China, who is risky. So it's kind of one of those like, that may be kind of just a black hole in the risk index, but it's there. Yes, ma'am.
So like when you're defining the risk, is it what's in consideration, like if you're about to take on like a country respond to, does it matter like what countries are in conflict?
No, so that's something we're working on for next year. But we just like part of the risk category is a conflict category. So if they're at a war with another country, it does count that. And I think the conflict category score does weight what countries you're at war with. So yes, it does take that into consideration. What it doesn't take into consideration is your neighborhood, right? So Taiwan would ostensibly be more risky because it's neighbors with China. We just haven't found a way to do that. And because the problem then is you get in the Middle East or Africa where just everybody's risky. So then the risk is inflated to a weird degree. And so we haven't figured out a way to do that. That is one of, and like you can read this in the report, that is our big limit. And we say that we're upfront about that. It's very difficult to take neighbors into consideration. Yes, sir. Yep, Cato Institute. So again, you can find last year's report out already. It's been out for a while. And then this year's report will come out in 10, 14 days. Okay. So what are some of these, like, are there problems with how we evaluate strategic and economic considerations? most of my work, and I would posit two yes are major problems. So one is by ignoring risk arms sales decisions, they focus really on these short-term benefits while discounting potential negative consequences. So that same report I told you about that you can look up now does a literature review on the problems with selling to risky countries, and they find three main problems. Blowback, kind of what it sounds like. We sell to a country that's an ally, they stop being an ally. We sell to a country that has a friendly regime that becomes unfriendly. We sell to a country, and then those weapons are used against the U.S. in a future conflict. Or you have the Al Qaeda and Iraq / ISIS situation, where we sold a lot of weapons to Iraq. Iraq couldn't control those weapons, couldn't keep hold of the weapons, and then they got in the hands of Al Qaeda and Iraq. They became ISIS, which is why when ISIS was at its heyday, you saw a lot of kind of this stuff about, oh, well, how is ISIS using American weapons against the U.S.? It's probably blowback. The second is entanglement and entrapment. And so this idea is the U.S. sells weapons to a country. The country gets involved in that conflict using those weapons, which inherently drags the U.S. into the conflict. This is very clear in Yemen. So we face entanglement issues in Yemen because Saudi Arabia is using our weapons against Yemeni civilians. There's a lot out there that says this is a problem in Syria, where we gave weapons to other countries to use in the conflict with Syria. They used those weapons, it made the U.S. liable, and then the U.S. sent in a few thousand military personnel. And then the final one, and this is more focused on small arms, is it creates regional instability. So that's the main first problem I have. The second problem I have is that it makes this assumption that allies are inherently good strategic partners, but when you're allies with over 50 some countries in the world, and you sell predominantly to allies, there is a world in which those allies aren't actually like very valuable strategically. So what you'll see a lot of like critics of alliances is that Montenegro joined NATO. Is the U.S. really willing to go to war with Russia over Montenegro? I think that's overblown. Personally, I don't think this is necessarily the biggest problem. But the idea here is there's this kind of just assumption that allies are always good, and sometimes they're not good strategic partners. My dissertation focuses a lot on when allies during conflict drive misperceptions. They get another country to do something stupid. And those Preble 2009, Posen in 2014, those are the only articles they wrote that year, so you can find them online pretty easily. So it's Chris Preble and Barry Posen. They talk a lot about this. Relatedly, by one accounting, Michael Beckley's 2015 article, the U.S. is responsible for coming to the aid of 25% of the world's population should their homelands come under attack. But there's really the U.S. shouldn't have to worry about that, at least by some arguments, because it is large, it is surrounded by water and Canada. It's very wealthy, and it has probably the strongest military in the globe. And so why is the U.S. willing to come to defense of that many individuals? So again, it gets like, are these allies really that strategically valuable, or are they a problem? 4, the focus on economic considerations signifies these short over long-term thoughts. So again, this goes back to risk. Policymakers clearly do not care as much about these long-term consequences, especially in the U.S., especially in a democracy, because their time in office is just limited. They care about these short-term benefits so they can stay elected. Relatedly, and I forgot to ask the question about economics, like do they help the economy? John Paul Dune is somebody you guys should look into because he's written a lot about this, and he has a lot of like really cool economic stuff. And what he's found is the weapons industry, like no matter how he does these studies, the weapons industry crowds out all other industries and actually creates economic slowdown compared to other alternatives. And so he finds that while there's these short-term economic benefits, people don't need to worry about the jobs. By investing so much in it, we're actually weakening the economy. All right, so I just have a few things to remember, and then I will kind of open myself up for questions. So 1, the U.S. defense industry continues to grow, and these foreign weapon sales are playing an increasingly large role. And it's no matter who's the president. Trump increased this significantly, but Obama did too, Bush did before him, etc. Second, arms sales are one of the key ways the U.S. transfers weapons. So again, they can do it by security assistance. They can do it if they have like a military intervention, bring troops with weapons. But generally, the most consistent way they do it is via arms sales. Again, we sell arms to the grand majority of countries across the world. 3, the U.S. has a process to sell weapons, though generally speaking, it does not stop sales. 4, the U.S. uses arms sales as a way to reinforce alliances and increase leverage. 5, the U.S. makes a lot of cash from these sales. And 6, risk does not play much of a role in determining where or how much we sell weapons. And I think that's it. Yeah, that's what I got. So, questions? Yeah.
Wait, so typically, if you have like high risk countries and low risk countries, like over time, does the risk increase in the region?
So there's a woman named Shannon Blanton, and she wrote 2 articles in the early 2000s that said that her argument is that when we sell countries, like we sell weapons to a risky country that's neighbored by a non-risky country, that non-risky country's risk increases. Personally, I think there's a lot of issues with that study, and it's just based on the data we had available at the time. It wasn't a lot. And so my guess is yes, but I don't know for a fact. Yeah, you have 2 fingers. That'll go.
Arms sales increase risk to whatever country you sell it to?
No, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is the U.S. doesn't care about risk where it sells weapons. And certainly arms sales don't reduce risk, right? We sold more to Saudi Arabia since 2002 than any country. Saudi Arabia consistently is one of the most risky countries across the globe. Yeah, you had a second.
On the thing that you're publishing, Institute, when, how do you find this thing, and how would I go about finding that?
If you go, so I'll send it out to you guys when it gets, or to Jackie when it gets out, but I will, you guys can just go on the Cato Institute, look at Cato Institute arms sales and keep an eye out. It's, again, 10 to 14 days. They already have the data, they already have the stuff, they're just formatting it at this point. So, did you have your hand up earlier? No, you go. Yeah.
What does U.S. allies some form of money, even though it's not like a lot?
Yeah, so there's a few things. So from a strategic point, they care about strengthening allies' military capacity, and they do believe they get leverage from these sales. And to a certain extent, they do. You can debate the leverage. It definitely strengthens allied military capacity. There was a big debate last year, and I have an article about this in Defense One from about a year ago. But the U.S. sells a lot to Turkey, and then Turkey said they would buy Russia missile systems. And the U.S. freaked out, rightfully so, because the U.S. was going to sell them F-35s, which are like the best aircraft we produce. But then also, if Turkey had Russian missile systems, it couldn't work with the U.S. weapon systems. They're incompatible. And so there was a lot of debate. The U.S. actually canceled the sales. So leverage is kind of in there, but definitely strengthen military capacity. From an economic standpoint, I would posit to you that the money is less important than the congressmen that benefit from it. It's short-term benefits. It's easy to point to. It's easy to say we created this many jobs or we brought in this much money. And so it's easy. It's very electable. And people get scared when you say, oh, we should reduce the weapons industry, because whether you're like, if any of you end up coming to George Mason gets a, again, academic term, shitload of money from these countries, from Raytheon, from Boeing, from Lockheed Martin. And so they're involved in a lot of industries. So those are kind of the things to me. That's the U.S. reasoning.
So if we found actually the same conflict, we need to use that after the conflict.
Yeah, generally, yes. I mean, usually what happens if we sell a lot to a country and the conflict breaks out and the country is not an ally, there usually is a debate process that goes through about should we continue selling. Conflicts usually don't last a long time, and so because of the way the notifications and deliveries process works, so again, after you notify of the sale, it takes 5 years to actually deliver those weapons. Generally, there's not a drop-off.
So, like, so after this thing seems pretty sort of theoretical, empirically, is selling to more risky countries, does that actually produce, like, adverse consequences?
I mean, that's up to you. Like, you're gonna have to argue. I don't. Again, I don't know what the resolution is. My guess is you will have to at some point this year argue both sides of that. What I would tell you from my research is yes, it does produce these negative consequences. And again, the risk factors, they're not actually super theoretical. Like, again, they're quantitative. They're metrics done by these organizations that look at these things quantitatively and produce scores. So they are risky. Now, the three like consequences of selling to those countries are theoretical, but so is everything in international security. We don't have laws in international security yet, but those things, when they've been published, have used generally like some sort of method to creating that argument. You have your hand up. Yeah, you.
Does the paper involve explaining the numbers you I know.
Yep. Yep. It'll be up there. And again, you can. The only change we made from 2018 to 2019 is we added the corruption perceptions index. Otherwise, it's the same. So if you look.
So just to follow up, so
Yeah.
2018 and 2019,
No, they can. You will see in the 2019 that comes out, we redid the risk scores for 2018. But 2018 is still good. Like, we still, I think in a year they got 4 academic citations, which is more or less unheard of, just based on the speed of academic publishing. So it's pretty good. Again, this is probably something you're gonna have to argue both sides of. My answer is no. So Saudi Arabia is a great example, right? Because that's the current debate, and everybody brings up Saudi Arabia. And everybody says, well, if we stop selling as many weapons to Saudi Arabia, if we sanction them on these sales because they commit politicide every possible place they can. My argument is Saudi Arabia still is dependent on the U.S. from oil. There's a lot of good research on this where you hear kind of publicly like, oh, the U.S. is dependent on oil. What you're actually seeing is the oil sellers are dependent on U.S. purchasing. And so I think the relationship with Saudi Arabia would probably change from a security standpoint, but they're building nuclear weapons anyways, right? That's not changing. Like, stopping arms sales isn't going to make them say, well, wait, we were building nuclear weapons, but now we're really going to build them. No, like, they're building nuclear facilities as we speak. And so I don't think you have to look at what people are saying are the benefits of selling to Saudi Arabia. The most common one I've heard about Saudi Arabia is better the enemy we know than the enemy we don't. We sell weapons. We know what Saudi Arabia does with them, and we know we can contain them. Did you have your hand up? No? Thought I saw another hand on this side. Okay, going back. Whoever, you haven't talked yet.
Okay, so if a high-risk country got weapons from the US and use them like
With the world, I have no idea. Well, just given geopolitics, they would probably blame the country that did it because it just doesn't make sense to go after the U.S. like just geopolitically. But like Russia would blame the U.S. more. So, yeah, you have it.
Do we sell other countries advanced targeting systems and software that go with the F-35 and like M1A2?
That's a good question. I don't know enough about the F-35 sales. My guess is along with that, well, I know with F-35 we sell training. So like no country just buys the F-35; they buy a whole package. My guess is the targeting systems are part of that package, or can be part of that package. Yes.
Okay. The sales requested these companies that are making these arms, do they have like this is
No, please. Yeah.
So the United States themselves have parents groups and so on, like weapons can be into
Right.
So like these companies, they have a say in whether or not they would make arms to sell to these certain countries within a
So for small arms, the companies don't care. Lockheed, like if we sell small arms, like small firearms, they don't give a rat's ass. For major conventional weapons, you reach the sale and then it goes through the State Department of Defense. Generally what happens in that process is not stopping the sale, but it's putting like certain requirements in the sale. So you have to learn how to use these weapons by X date. You can only use these weapons for Y purposes. Do we always follow that? We try, but again, so you sell targeting systems to Saudi Arabia so they stop bombing civilians and they hit more civilian targets, but they say it was an accident. Are they violating the agreement where you said you can't hit civilian targets with it? Yeah.
So so the State Department, there are actually United States foreign policy. Does that usually country or is there some sort of conflict of interest between the company selling the weapons and the United States state foreign policy?
I mean, it depends if you think what the U.S. publicly says about its foreign policy is actually it's what it believes it should act on. I think the U.S. is mainly concerned, so politicians usually are concerned with getting reelected. That's what most of the literature says. So from an economic standpoint, it's just easier to approve these sales. From a foreign policy standpoint, I think a lot of politicians, especially now, if you watch these Democratic primary debates, every time a foreign policy question's asked, without fail, every time they bring it back to economics. So Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren are saying that foreign policy is an extension of economic policy, so we can only be allies with countries that have similar economies, economies that benefit all populace or whatever. So it's hard. The U.S. likes these companies. The companies do a great job for the U.S. military themselves. So the U.S. doesn't sanction them frequently. And again, you hit a lot of blowback if you do, right? Like George Mason, the Koch brothers, et cetera, would lose their collective shifts if. Yep.
So would you say that over time as so-called military-industrial complex is still growing right now?
Define the military-industrial complex. My answer is yes, but if you define it better, I'll give you.
So, I mean, what I mean by this is the whole loop of almost militaries money and all the military, which is companies more money to go lobby, which increases conflict, which is that cycle of loop.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a problem. I think there's a few arguments I could see, and again, I don't know the topic, but I coached a public forum team last year that had a similar topic, and I know a lot of people ran that type of argument, is that you have these weapon sales, and there's almost a conflict of interest, right? The U.S. says they want to stay out of conflict, they want to reduce conflict, but then you're selling things that create conflict. Yeah. And then,
You know.
So like gun trafficking.
so that's small arms. Those are small arms.
What how
Yep. It depends on the gun, but generally yes. As long as it's not a military grade technology. So if it's military grade though, then you have all that. Did you have?
Yeah, so it's kind of a twofold question.
Yeah.
You mentioned how security and administrative systems are not completely captive by themselves. If there were restrictions placed on ourselves, would you imagine the US would just cheat those conditions?
So that's a really good question. What we've seen is the reverse. So when there was the coup in Egypt in 2011, I think was the coup, you saw the U.S. State Department refuse to call it a coup. There was some tension in Egypt. There was a transfer of power, but they would not use the word coup. And the reason why is the second they used that word coup, they couldn't give security assistance to Egypt anymore. Do I think that, vice versa, if the U.S. stops selling arms, it'll send more security assistance? No, because I think they're different. I think they're used for two different things. I think security assistance is used to shift the balance of power in areas we want to shift the balance of power. I think arms sales are used just broadly. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is the Browning M2 or other mounted HMGs, are they considered small arms for this? Or?
I would look. You can look at the. It's USML. I forgot what that. But you can look. It has everything categorized. If you're asking me about specific weapon systems, I just don't know as much about how they're categorized. But Yeah, just look at the USML. And then like there's also an opportunity to say these are considered small arms, but in reality the impact they're having is the same as the major conventional weapons, or vice versa. So they're considered major conventional weapons, but they're used in the way small arms get used. Whatever one of you two wants to go first.
Does this apply to non-nation?
I mean, yes, we don't in our stuff don't look at those just because you gotta like have some sort of like where are we gonna stop.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, sure. And if you go to the SIPRI, Stockholm Institute for Peace Research Initiative, or something, they have all that stuff on there. So like every like commercial to commercial sale, et cetera, et cetera. Yep, they have all that. They track all. So does Security Assistance Monitor, but Security Assistance Monitor only does it for the U.S. Yep.
So what's the NRA's role in all of this?
The NRA, so I have an article about this last month at Defense One. It's with Trevor Thrall, so you can find it. But the NRA hates small arms regulations. And it's because the NRA fundamentally believes global small arms regulations are going to result in countries demanding domestic small arms regulations. And so what they say they're worried about is, yeah, we get into this treaty, but all the countries we're allied with don't have the Second Amendment. And what if those countries say, oh, well, you got to start restricting guns at home? The NRA also has just a lot of general political power. And so they have lobbied very hard against small arms regulations. Usually when you see Republican control of one of the branches of government, you see less small arms regulations for that reason.
So with NRA lobbying and I guess Cohen and all Lockheed and all of those companies lobbying, would you say that like they don't have a lot of oversight?
No, I mean, well, again, technically they do have a lot of oversight. In reality, the oversight is not, it's name only. It's ostensibly there really isn't much. Yeah.
Is this a bad thing? Like, or no, this is bad?
Depends who you ask and why you're asking it. Personally, my research, what I am most concerned with is kind of these long-term consequences. Just generally speaking, I think it's dangerous. I think there's humanitarian cost to this too, which I think is dangerous. I think what's going on in Yemen would not be going on to the degree it's going on if Saudi Arabia didn't have the most advanced U.S. technology. But there are benefits, and I've talked about those, right? There are strategic benefits. They do give, to some degree, the U.S. gets leverage. Ray Rounds, the guy Ray Rounds is his name, and I'm friendly with him, but he totally disagrees. And if you read his stuff at like War on the Rocks, he will argue the exact opposite case that I'm arguing, which is that from a strategic standpoint, having arms sales gives us leverage we otherwise would not have. And yes, there are costs, but those costs are going to exist whether or not the U.S. sells arms.
Sorry, I missed the beginning.
No, you're good.
All right, so